Insights with me, Lynne O'Donnell. I'm joined by Mina Sharifi. She's an author, an activist, a teacher and mentor. She spent more than half her life in Afghanistan after finishing her education in Canada, and she worked in a variety of fields, including in media organisations and with impoverished and orphaned children. We discussed the way Afghan people have been portrayed since the fall of Afghanistan to Taliban control in 2021, and who controls the narrative. It's a complex topic that isn't often addressed, but should be, as it impacts directly how the rest of the world interacts or does not interact with the Taliban. Have a listen. Hi Mina, thanks so much for joining me today. We want to talk about identity and narrative and perspective. These are pretty broad and deep and complex topics to discuss. So why don't we start with an introduction? You have a unique lens through which to view Afghanistan, if I may say. You're an Afghan raised in the diaspora in Canada, where you're a citizen and taxpayer. And you went to Afghanistan almost straight out of college and that's where we met. And you had a pretty varied and illustrious career there. Can you go into detail about your background and perspective? What took you to Afghanistan? What did you do? And what was your experience?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me, Lynn. And it's always great to see you. We did meet in Afghanistan. And I think all of us have unique experiences and unique lenses. But perhaps in the context of Afghanistan, there are not many who have had the same as I have, which did kind of involve growing up in the West and then later having an adulthood in Afghanistan, whereas oftentimes in the Afghan community, it's the other way around, of a childhood in Afghanistan and being raised in the West. I went to Afghanistan in 2005. It was a chance opportunity. I had not grown up thinking I would have an opportunity to go to Afghanistan, nor had I designed my life around it because I didn't expect it. So when I had an opportunity appear to volunteer at an NGO called Impacts that did leadership training for women in radio stations across the country. I had just finished school and I'd studied radio and television broadcast. And I was nervous to say yes, but the curiosity got the better of me. I had a lot of nerves and I got past them. I thought, I don't speak enough. I don't speak the language well enough. No one's going to like me. Security was very low on the list of fears, but there were many, and I got past them. And I went to Afghanistan, and it was meant to be a 6-month contract. And I ended up staying for just under 15 years, and really wholeheartily am grateful that I had that opportunity. My background isn't quite as consistent an answer or simple an answer as some might have. I didn't stick to one thing. I worked in NGOs. I have consulted for some of the bigger organizations like Afghan and IOM. I've worked mainly, though, for privately owned media and consultancies that were Afghan owned. But the variation has given me a lot of, I think, access to different groups in Afghanistan. Also, family life has given me different access to groups in Afghanistan. I feel like I had some exposure to many of the different groups that we talk about now, whether it's foreigners, the military, the embassies, families, the provinces. And I'm really grateful for the fact that I couldn't decide what I wanted to do for so long. So I was trying new things throughout that period.
You worked with kiddies as well a lot. I remember you were working with underprivileged and orphaned children.
Yeah, I actually started my own mentorship program for young women and girls in Afghanistan, and working with children. Whether I was in doing media programming for children, educational programming, has always been my favorite of the different categories, because there's just they're so open to what's next. And that's, I think they've given me a lot of my optimistic or hopeful attitude about Afghanistan comes from those young people.
Wonderful. And I've talked quite a bit really about the control of the narrative, the post collapse, post August 2021 narrative, by which we mean who gets to talk on behalf of Afghans, of Afghan women, Afghan girls, of the Afghan people. And when we were talking about this the other day, you pointed out that I, for instance, would never be asked to talk on behalf of Australian women. And I'm guessing that that came up because you are asked to speak on behalf of Afghan women. Why do you think that is? Why don't we hear from regular people, or do they get silenced?
Well, I think it's a combination of how poorly we are asked to speak on Afghanistan and then who we speak to. And mainly it's about exclusively speaking to some people. How we're asked to begin with is kind of a trap, asking like you mentioned, how do Afghan women feel? There is no single Afghan woman who can answer for all Afghan women. And we don't do that in other countries and in other situations. We don't put that expectation on a single person to speak on behalf of a whole population. And why I say that's a trap is whatever they say, whoever disagrees with it can say, that person doesn't represent all of us. Why are you asking her to answer for all of us? This person is diaspora. This person is former government. This person is from Kabul and not the provinces. There will always be a legitimate way to counter any woman's voice because she's being asked to speak on behalf of everyone. So if they don't like what she's saying, they can just argue that she doesn't represent them. And another part of what we're asked that feels like a trap is, so what is the solution going forward? I don't think that there's any position of anyone who should be asked what is the solution to Afghanistan. It's as complicated and convoluted as it can possibly be, and to put that pressure on a single person, it also is a form of invalidating their view, which is valid, from their lens. But putting the task on them to solve it is pretty interesting because all of those countries came to Afghanistan and couldn't seem to figure it out. And we've got a long history of really muddled, attempts at solutions. So if we could just talk to people about what their lens is, that would be a nice change.
Well, you did go to the meeting of women's groups and representatives and women that was held in the Albanian capital a couple of weeks ago, I want to say. It might be a couple of months ago. The year's nearly over. Yeah. In September. Okay, so yeah, last month still. What did you find there? There were a couple of hundred women who went along, some of whom came from Afghanistan. Did you find well, you can say what it is that you did find, but I'm wondering whether there was a desire to find a united voice, or at least find that word again, narrative, that could be put out there to international media, governments, whatever, in order to at least try and understand what the situation is for Afghan women and come to some sort of broad brush understanding of what the situation is and what the desires going forward and needs are.
Right. So yeah, looking for sort of a cohesive message to come from these women, I think was definitely the goal. I went and I appreciated being included because it wasn't a typical meeting of just the same faces in one room. It included a lot of different walks of life. So there were artists there, and there were, like you said, women coming straight from Afghanistan. I sincerely appreciated that. Now, was everybody on course to come up with a cohesive message together? No, I think some members were, and you'll find this anywhere in any big group, some were threatened by what it meant for them individually if we all came up with something together, I think. But ultimately, I did see that there was an understood message that we wanted better for the women in Afghanistan. And that was across the board. How people went about it is obviously always going to differ, but I really appreciated this first step in bringing multiple voices together. And I would participate in something like that again. I do think that it's very early stages, so we're almost just putting together who we've heard and who we've seen. And the broader that gets, the more cohesive our message is going to get. The broader the inclusion, the more cohesive the message.
Yeah, and you can't really develop thought, can you, without discussion and debate and having your own ideas challenged. So, it's not, is it coming together and putting together, finding a way of expressing, as we were talking about before, ideas and desires on behalf of all Afghan women. It's about developing thought processes and ideas and, something cohesive, but it doesn't have to be the one idea that everybody decides to latch onto, does it?
No, but interestingly enough, we were all very unified on the stance against how women are being treated in Afghanistan, and on the agreement that absolutely women are against how they're being treated in Afghanistan. And being treated is a very light way to put it. We'll say that the actual control that the Taliban openly, with their own mouths and their own decrees, declares that they want on the women of Afghanistan. So it's not hearsay. We're responding to exactly what the Taliban announced, and everybody across the board was there to stand against that. That was a cohesive message that I think, even as simple as it is lost because we're so caught up on who's saying it. So it was a chance for everyone to say it together.
And the ladies who came from Afghanistan, how was their experience there? They must have come out and described to everybody else. Everybody must have been clamoring to know, what is it really like? Because for those women who did not experience it with Taliban 1.0 or whatever, first time round 96 to 2001, they have the stories and the tales and the experiences of their mothers and their grandmothers and maybe aunts and older sisters, but still experiencing something for yourself is to really cut through your own imagination. And I found this, the first, if I just might, say something about me. The first time I went to Afghanistan as a resident reporter, I thought that the stuff about women and women's rights and the way women are treated, because we do have to remember that under those 20 years of the Republic, it was a coming out from under the rock, if you like. And so Afghan society was still, and as it remains, misogynist and repressive for very many women, the majority of women. And regularly it was described as the worst place in the world to be born female. But I couldn't imagine it. I went with my friend and colleague, Masood Hosseini. We travelled around the country and we did a series of stories on the experiences of women. And until we did that specifically, there was no way I, as a Western woman, with the struggles that we have anyway, could have possibly understood what the situation was and is for Afghan women. We can only imagine how bad it is. So that's a long way of getting around to saying, what were the women who came from Afghanistan to the Tirana meeting talking to you about and describing?
Okay, well, yeah, just to backtrack on the, how things are described, you're right. Like, they are described in very short, like, it's the worst place in the world. I mean, but never was anyone thinking, is it the worst place in the world because of who's in control, or is it the worst place in the world because that's how Afghans are? And that's the misconception. It's about what was being inflicted on Afghanistan versus what Afghanistan is. But in the Tirana meeting, I will say two things that really validated where we were all coming from. Was when the women arrived from Afghanistan, I was in one of the group in the group discussions, and they had just arrived from the airport, exhausted. It had taken days. They'd been kicked off of their plane, and they were talking about struggles both within Afghanistan and then in neighboring Pakistan as far as getting to this workshop, that you know they really saw a lot of harassment. And the woman who sat down next to me burst into tears as a paper was handed to her to catch her up with the workshop. She said, "I can't even look at this. I have nothing. Like my mind won't function to read this. I just beg you to get it to stop. We can't. We aren't living anymore." And she burst into tears, and we all cried with her, because we know this to be true, and it's very difficult as women who, yourself, myself, others who want to speak up for the women of Afghanistan and are consistently discredited. It's hard to say, well, that's what's happening. Now, in a sense, this woman could be discredited just by simply not physically being in Afghanistan anymore. But where does that stop? When do we get to say that, this is valid, this is what happened? Part of that, the conference was listening to Mariam Safi, who runs Drops, and she is really dedicated to having that data for you, so that you don't want to listen to us and you want to call us all wrong. All of us are incorrect. The women there are actually happy. Well, let's see what they have to say. And she's conducted a good deal of research, and it lines up with what we're all saying. There is no confusion. They are trying to make it look that way, but what that woman said is consistent with what the girls that I speak to on a daily basis are saying. It's consistent with what, women who have been arrested and have come out are saying. There is no inconsistency with the fact that women are being oppressed in Afghanistan.
And more each day.
Right. And so it's just a waiting game of, well, what's next? And then for those things that we don't see in the stupid YouTube videos, because you see a woman walking on the street, it doesn't change the fact that the laws are being designed to get her off of those streets. And the laws are being designed by the words of the Taliban themselves. So, it's a terrible comparison because it's nothing the same. But in the West, for example, we have the debate about abortion, and we don't decide that just because it still happens that it's fine. Then what matters is that the law either allows it or doesn't, and we don't treat Afghanistan that way. We just treat it as this visual vacation that you took, validates what is or isn't true for the daily life of people who live there. So sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent there, but I do think that the validity is already in what the women are saying and in what the Taliban themselves are saying.
Yeah, but I just it boggles my mind that it's permitted to by the outside world to continue, because it is validated by every Western diplomat who has a meeting with a Taliban figure. Now Britain is stealthily re-establishing what it calls engagement, but is effectively diplomatic representation, whether it's just below the level of ambassador or not. And this is taken, and they surely know, the British surely know that the Taliban take this as tacit validation and recognition of their regime, and so then they double down. This is what boggles my mind. What side of history do you want to be on?
Well, I think with politicians, oftentimes their history is only as far as their own placement in a position. So they're only going to be remembered for their little 4 years or their little 2 years. And so as long as they've, whether it's filling their pockets, whether it's making their name in some other category, whether it's saying, hey, don't worry, we don't have troops there, or whatever their narrative is, it's usually very self-fulfilling, motivation. So I'm not surprised at that. I don't think anyone's as worried about where they will stand in history as they should be, but they're not necessarily the most ethical people to begin with. So I'm not sure.
Well, there is that.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
While it matters, to many of them.
Yeah, yeah, but
I'm not
these are people with mothers and wives, daughters, sisters. It's like
sure, but
the,
what about the
mm,
feminist leaders? They're women themselves, never mind
yeah,
having a sister or a daughter. And they're also thinking about, they're not, I don't think people are affected by things until it's a threat to their own safety and their own comfort. I think with the masses, that is how it is. I don't think that everyone in Afghanistan is worried about what's going on in Sudan. And it's fair
yeah,
to have a little bit of disconnect. I understand that. But that's why when I speak on Afghanistan, I tend not to demand everybody care about the women of Afghanistan. But as women, we are all under threat when something like this is happening in Afghanistan. Whereas
mm,
security wise, we're all under threat when something
mm,
like this is happening in Afghanistan. So it's the masses that I think could and should be affected. Um, as far as leaderships, it's just a rotation of what's going to it's usually greed centric, and it's a narrative that they need or don't need. Currently they
mm,
don't need to help Afghan women.
mm,
And
mm.
20 years ago it was convenient, and right now it's not.
Yeah,
um,
this is true. And when I'm asked to speak publicly or on media engagement or whatever, I try to make that point that when you normalize the extremes, then those
mhm,
extremes move in. And the last couple of years, American women, I think that they can be forgiven for not concentrating on what's going on in far off places because they're fighting for their own physical autonomy and reproductive rights in an election that happens in a week or so. So yeah, I think you're right that it's while we're all under threat, it's very difficult for people to look outside the immediate threats that they face. And women in very many parts of the world are facing their own immediate threats. I mean, mass kidnappings and rapes in certain parts of East Africa, for instance. I mean, um, when you wonder how much worse it can actually get much worse. Yeah.
yeah, the common sort of population, I would say the masses, I have some, compassion for the fact that they are concerned with what's happening in front of them. And just to be fair, I don't think that of leadership. And when I say leadership, that includes feminist leadership, people, women who do know and who really make a livelihood, sometimes a business out of speaking up for women's rights. For them to be ignoring it is pretty outrageous, because they know that whatever the worst case scenario is for women is really the case for all of us. And
Yeah.
to know about it and to not speak on it is happening as well. And that
Mm.
is absolutely as vile as what the politicians are doing.
Yeah, I've even thought that, I get very irritated about the Taliban cricket team, as I call them, and I wonder whether choosing something like sport,
Mhm.
and the fact that women are not allowed to play any sport, which means that their health in every way is affected, whether or not, because global sport is run by men, and cricket, for instance, is controlled in Australia by an organisation called Cricket Australia, and they have decided against bilateral contact with the Afghan cricket team because of the ban on women playing sport. And as we know, Afghanistan had a women's cricket team and a healthy approach to it, to
Mhm.
developing the sport for women and girls. And I think that is when you see the way women's participation in sports that have been dominated by men, like soccer, football, for instance, and cricket, is becoming much more popular. I'm in the UK, and stadiums fill to watch women play soccer. It's quite astounding. So I'm wondering whether or not you could get to those organisations that are dominated by men and the male sport, and make them realise that their ethos for equality in the sport is being totally undermined by associations that they are actively engaged in.
Sure. I mean, yeah, but who are they going to lose from maintaining a relationship or not? I don't think they have a lot on the line as far as their ethos go, because really in theory, their own Australia itself could be held accountable for some things that have happened in Afghanistan, and we could
This
say
is
the
true.
Australian team should be
Yeah.
banned because of, so I don't know that that necessarily goes as far as impact in a larger sense, but
Mhm.
absolutely, like, these messages matter because of how they affect the masses' understanding of what's going on. If it
Yeah,
raises that awareness, I'm
which is
all
the
for it.
point. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, there do seem to be so many people and groups purporting to represent the Afghan people, as the anti-Taliban opposition. For instance, a dozen blokes who want to be the president, some looking for the next war, as we know. What does this lead to in terms of, if we're going back to discussing the narrative, in terms of mixed and muddled messaging, do you think, Mina? And what's the way to get through that?
Well, yeah, that's the difference between the one side and the other, right? Like this big muddled messaging, because on the anti-Taliban side, we've got a competition, right? Of what does it mean? If it's not going to be Taliban, then is it going to be you? Or I want it to be me though. And
Yeah.
so it's difficult to have a cohesive message, but that is the solution to first and foremost rid the country, the population of this oppressive regime. If you
Mm.
can't get together and make that message, then you can't get everyone to stand behind you, because there are loyalties, and there are opportunists who are doing it in a hope of getting more business and whatever else. So Afghans see through most of those motivations, and even if there is a good one, sometimes maybe we're just at this point like suspicious of everybody. So it's really, really a
Mm.
difficult situation to have
Mm.
a strong stand. But the first step, I would imagine, is is the most difficult one, which is where we say, okay, let all of what happens next rest for a moment, and let's talk first about what we're facing. And kind of like a house burning down, but worrying about how you're going to reconstruct it
Mm.
while it's
Mm.
still burning. I think the emergency is in front of us.
Mm. Well, and the trauma and the shock takes a long time to overcome. And I think maybe, I don't know, I'm not a professional in this area, but maybe a lot of the confusion and mixed messaging um, is symptomatic of the profound and ongoing trauma that many people are experiencing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the regular population, if we'll call them that, the more, less political spaces, they I think that population is in survival mode. And so you don't
Mm.
necessarily hear like, well, I have the solution, I'm next to lead. You don't hear that from the regular people just yet, because of that, like you said, trauma and really
Mm.
a
Mm.
survival mode. And the pattern in Afghanistan has been, when one is gone, a new one will come in. And so let's just maintain our community, do what we need to do, and let's wait and see what's next. At least from the
Mm.
point of view of most men who are not affected by just how hard and terrible one versus the other is for
Yeah, well,
women.
that's a good point. But given that the Taliban have effectively closed down Afghanistan, I mean, it's becoming darker and darker every day, really, taken over the media, co-opted media moguls as their spokesmen effectively, and are ruling by fear. This would seem to cede the space to the loudest voice, especially when the international media is prone to listening to the loudest voice. What do you regard as the advantages and disadvantages that the Taliban have when it comes to messaging, versus those who take a position against them?
Okay, so Taliban do have a pretty big advantage in that they've had 20 years to prepare their very simple unified message, right?
Yeah.
Whereas 3 years in and still in shock, they've had
Mm.
20 years to focus on the simplicity of their message. It's their message is so easy. Everyone's bad except us. So it's really straightforward. They've had all of these years to prepare and train for the media and for everything else. I don't know that they thought they were going to govern so quickly, but they have had a coherent message working. So they have that to their benefit. They also obviously have the benefit of being so upheld and uplifted by leaderships who, whatever their motivation, whether it's to extract goods from Afghanistan, whatever, if it's dollar signs in their eyes or love for misogyny, doesn't matter. They are clearly being uplifted. They're not being stopped. So they've got a lot of advantages. But as far as what they don't have, is the majority support in Afghanistan. And they won't, because there is a higher population of youth than anyone else. And most of the youth was born into a relative amount of security. I'm not trying to imply that those 20 years were fantastic, or good leadership, or even anything other than a different version of an occupation. Sure. But most definitely it was secure enough that women were reemerging from the first round of Taliban oppression. And with that happening, a lot of people have grown up realizing what they can strive for, what they can dream for. And young people are not going to easily be convinced that the ideology that's in front of them is the correct way to live, or that it is even to be identified with who they are. They know who they are. They know their own music. They know their value for education. A lot did change in a very quick time, not in how people feel, but in the opportunity to live that way, to be able to go to work, to be able to rejoin society. They'd always wanted it, and they still want it.
Yeah, but you described the lady who came to the Tirana meeting directly from Afghanistan, who was sitting next to you, and she was so exhausted by the experience that she had come from. She said her brain wasn't working. When you exhaust people to the point where they cannot think anymore, that's when you win, and you take their boys away from them and put them in madrasas and teach them to hate. There's an indication in there. You could look at that in very, very many ways. The rule by fear, but also the hollowing out of culture and independent thought, and the killing of desire for something else. And then you end up like, I've been to North Korea a couple of times, automatons who are just happy to have food, you know what I mean? When they get food, it's a way of ensuring that you have a fertile ground for your power, because that's all it is. It's about power and money. And I wonder how long it goes on with the extreme success and, if I may say, collusion of outside forces, whether it's rolling over and hoping that things will change, which the UN and Western governments seem to do, or like you say, getting out of it what you can because you've got dollar signs over, access to minerals or goods or whatever. How long does that go on before it's irreversible? We've seen things today on social media of women sitting in a classroom being taught to now is the time for jihad. We bring up our children as little jihadis. It boggles the mind, but I think this is part of the project. And then it goes to a point, doesn't it, where they believe, the people who perpetuate this believe that there is no coming back from it.
Well, definitely. Yeah, I agree with your point. There's a lot of exhaustion. I would never deny that. And I don't deny that that is the plan. I mean, one of the decrees, if you look closely, they're even saying, no playing marbles, no playing with dolls. So they're wanting to start early because they understand that that's how half of the Taliban was formed to begin with. Their own soldiers were taken at young ages and indoctrinated. So indoctrination is really their game plan, and it's obvious to get to the psyche of the Afghan population while they're still young. I don't think the window of time is so small, though. I mean, you have to remember that they've been in power before with nobody watching, with no one paying attention, and musical instruments were buried, and TV was quiet, and kites were painted black to still fly. Like, the spirit isn't that easy
Kill.
to get. And those same children who are born without the legal ability to play with dolls are still going to play with dolls. Afghans are far from, deciding that whatever leadership says is what we do. So while I understand that it's going to have catastrophic outcomes for the population as a whole, and how it presents, and perhaps even security of the rest of the world, I don't know that they're going to be as easily, they're not going to be successful that easily. There is with an obvious lack of support, we still have women on the streets protesting. With that obvious danger and determination to get to her psyche, the woman who sat beside me made it to Albania. I mean, so the as long as that exists, and I've never seen that disappear in Afghanistan, then we don't necessarily need to look at it as a clock. It's more just a matter of stop uplifting them, and let's see if we can. The timeline I look at is when we rise against it. It's a matter of time there as well.
Yeah, indeed, the pressure cooker. Just the lid shaking on the pressure cooker. It's going to blow. We just don't know when. So who do we hear from, Mina? Which voices do we hear from, and who do we dismiss as ineligible to speak, and on what grounds?
Well,
is that a fair question?
Yeah, I mean, really, we hear from similar voices, and there's so much irony in who we hear from. Like, we've got op-eds written by people who were born and raised in neighboring countries, who have things to say about others who were raised elsewhere. I mean, diaspora is one example. How much of the former government was raised in neighboring countries but not considered diaspora? There's no one who I think should be the ultimate voice, and no one that I think should be dismissed. If you collect a variety of voices and lenses as you would in any other country, that's when you get the message you need. Who we are hearing from are people with the I think the right connections to speak, the right platforms to speak, with places like the New York Times cooperating the way they are with the Taliban. They've got a lot of lucky breaks. They've also got a lot of people masquerading as humanitarians or intellectuals who are obviously tied to the Taliban. But if they're given all these opportunities, that's when we know we're just hearing from the same voice in different forms, in different faces, but the same voice. Now, if they wanted to hear from anyone else, then the message would be clear that it's not okay what's happening in Afghanistan. And occasionally they'll put some women on some spaces. But who we should be hearing from, is the second part of your question, was just really include more. I'm not against hearing random guy who grew up in a neighboring country tell me intellectually how great the Taliban is. Fine. But beside that person, you need to also have someone who recently left and was born and raised there, and who has seen the before and the after. Not, and maybe on CNN, we don't necessarily need to only have someone who you've decided is a humanitarian. Can we look into people's backgrounds just a little bit? I mean, that would make a difference. And then have as many people as you want, just not the same consistent, group we all see. We all see the same few names.
Well, that's what I was basically alluding to before. The loudest voice is the squeakiest wheel, and there is a laziness to it for sure. But the New York Times seems to be eternally infatuated with Siraj Haqqani, which is really quite. I was going to say amusing. I was going to say shocking. I don't really know how to feel about it.
Well, I mean,
I don't understand it.
How often is media really going to highlight how bad things are in Afghanistan, truly, when media is working under leaderships that are continuing to uphold the Taliban and leadership. So I think there's a connection between the media kind of wanting things to look better than they are for the purposes of their own leadership. And how often has media been known to say our leadership is part of this problem? That never happens. So that I think it makes sense to me why the media is not really raising the right voices. And also too, if we could be generous, I would say that the media is ashamed of the situation in Afghanistan and therefore not bringing up the failures of their leadership. Again, that's generous. I don't think it even goes that deep. I think it's just a matter of consistency with the messaging that they're supposed to put out, which is that things are fine. That's why we're not there, and that's why we're just shaking their hands and smiling with them.
Yeah, that's not journalism though, you know.
It's
An
definitely
op-ed, yeah, but an op-ed on the opinion pages is one thing. As egregious as it was that Sirajuddin Haqqani got that space, what, less than a week before the Doha deal was signed, and it didn't say, you know, really who he is, with his byline. That's one thing, almost forgivable, if not, you know, hard to understand. But I think, you know, a couple of thousand words that mostly tries to whitewash a mass murderer as a moderate who can be trusted to lead a strategically important country through deep, deep troubles is really beyond my comprehension. Can I say that?
Yeah, absolutely. The shock hasn't worn off, I don't think, for anyone, because it's not like another one will come and paint them in a good light and we won't be shocked. We'll be shocked every time, but it has been going on for quite a while. If you remember the New York Times as the same example, after immediately after the fall, when they were raiding, I think, Dostum's house, which, like, I'm not trying to say that he's a great guy, but they were raiding a home, period. Their action was raiding a home because they're raiding the entire country in theory, right? This is what they've come to do. And they were painted as Peter Pan, like, we're here to help the poor. Look at these riches. The riches are terrible. Yes, the riches are terrible, but you're also invading a country in the process. And there's just a way of painting things that the places like the New York Times have chosen to do. And so it's been right from the beginning. It's not surprising that they're consistently sort of sticking to their story, that this is more good news than bad.
Yeah, and it was almost portrayed as a comedy, wasn't it? Here's these Taliban guys have raided Dostum's house and they're putting his hat on. You know, it was like Kim Jong Il, the father of the current leader of North Korea, was consistently painted as an amusing character, as was the current guy because of his haircut, international man of mystery, and all of this sort of thing. Whereas there was nothing funny about it when people were being starved to death and the leadership was getting fat, and now they're sending, you know, brainwashed automaton style soldiers to fight against Ukraine on Russia's behalf. I mean, it's a dangerous way of playing down the reality, as you say.
I think we all get a little bit tricked into doing it ourselves. We're always dehumanizing the Taliban soldiers, forgetting that they've also been used from a very young age to enforce something that leadership themselves doesn't practice. I think this is a very general, obviously, something that happens all the time, but we are also falling into making them a joke versus really seeing the danger of what that brainwashing has done to them and how that's being invited into Afghanistan.
Yeah, and dehumanizing anybody really undermines, well, it kind of plays them out, doesn't it? It's for instance, I was having a discussion yesterday with somebody who was held hostage by the Taliban for many months with a number of other people, and he said he'd been in touch with one of the other guys. They had a really hard time, you know. They were held for in awful circumstances, as you can imagine, for almost a year. And now this other guy is being contacted by one of his captives who was sacked from his job and is unemployed now and is looking for a job with an international NGO. And at first I thought, oh my God, you know, does the chutzpah know limit? And then I thought, the guy's just trying to survive, you know?
Yeah.
He's just trying to survive. Make him human too.
Well, I mean, when we first arrived in those earlier years, I remember in 2005, the very first time that I came across someone who openly said he worked for the Taliban. Of course, I was taken aback by it. Yep, but that was his job. I mean, we have a whole population, and that's the thing everyone needs to kind of wake up about. It's going to become everyone's job and everyone's best interest to do what the Taliban say at some point. And at some point when they're trained that that is the way to do things, it's going to be at the cost of security of other countries. It's going to be at the cost of women's rights everywhere. And it is only Afghan suffering now. I say the word only because that's how it feels. It feels like it's
exactly.
So it doesn't matter yet.
Yeah, but as it was when Saddam Hussein ran Iraq, if you weren't part of the Ba'ath Party, you were going nowhere. In China, the Chinese Communist Party, if you don't have some relationship with it, you're going nowhere. This is the reality in autocratic regimes. You've got to go along to get along, and that's the sad and tragic part about it, and something that we really have to recognise. While trying to, you know, come to terms with and undermine and get rid of, you know, it's just the way it is. Yeah,
it is. Yeah. So to be able to look at all of it as look at people as individuals, I think is really important in the grand scheme of things. But right now, if we could even just keep it to leadership, we don't even do that.
No, indeed. Well, Mina, we are coming to the nearing the end of our time, but I'd just really like to ask you, what are your own hopes? How does this end? Not just for women, but for the country and the region that is being profoundly affected by what's going on in Afghanistan now.
Well, yeah, I have big hopes, and that hope doesn't come from nothing. I think a lot of times, especially before the fall, I would often be, I think, dismissed personally as someone who's more naive and romanticizes the whole idea of Afghanistan. And I wasn't sure if I did that or not, but I know now that I don't. I say what I say based on exposure to multiple, you know, categories of people and provincial and non-provincial, and it's easy to find hope the more you are exposed to the people of Afghanistan. They have gone through a lot already. I don't know what the particular political solution is for this. I would say that as a simplified answer, I would say we don't want someone to come in and save Afghanistan. We just want people to stop uplifting their oppressors. And if we could really kind of understand that as the message of what all of the people that I've spoken to in Afghanistan are saying, I've never heard anyone say, come in and do this. They've just said, stop what you are doing, because this is how it's affecting us. And so if that message were something more clear, we could potentially get more support from people. And it's always dismissed as stop asking for help. It's not asking for help to ask someone to demand a stop to something. That's not asking for help. That's for asking for responsibility.
Yes, and there aren't any consequences to the worsening behaviour. $40 million a week, at least we know, goes into Afghanistan shrink wrapped on pallets every week. A friend of mine the other day suggested, take away $1 million a week, and in 40 weeks there's nothing. But I tell you, I absolutely guarantee that by week 20, there'd be action. There would be consequences. There would be, oh, hang on a second, what do we have to
Right.
do to get the money? Yeah, because it's about money. This is a criminal cartel, which thrives on money
They
and
absolutely get
power.
no
Mm,
consequences. They're instead of that uplifted. And that is
yeah.
such a fact. We can see it. We can see the selfies. We can see the love. We can see the lack of opposition to what they're doing from
Mm,
the masses and from leaderships around the world.
yeah, indeed. Well, my dear, thank you so much for your time, and I wish you well, and hope that, yeah, your optimism and your hope and your love pays off sooner rather than later.
Thank you, and likewise, thank you so much for what you do and speaking to the side that not everyone wants to hear from.
Indeed. Thanks again. That was Mina Sharifi, a stalwart of the Afghan diaspora. She's an inspiration for many, not least the young women who she talks to in Afghanistan on a daily basis and encourages not to lose hope. We talked about narratives, who gets to control the message, who speaks for Afghans, for women and girls, for people generally, and how there is no such thing as an undeserving voice. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. That's all for now. I'm Lynne O'Donnell. Bye bye.